Hi, everyone. We're just getting ourselves to go live on Facebook. If you give me a moment, we'll get there.
Did you see Leah's chat?
Haven't seen it yet.
You guys rock.
Oh, gosh. All right.
See you.
All right. And now we're live on Facebook. And I think we are broadcasting to the world at live. I know we have somebody in Abu Dhabi. I want to say welcome, everyone. This is the first of our Chebacco Chats, a interview with authors of the current issue of Chebacco. Chebacco is now in its 21st volume. We've been publishing since 1998, and this is what our cover looks like now. These are all on their way out to the world. 600 copies are going to members, libraries, historical societies, and schools. And you should be getting yours if you're a member of the society within the next couple of weeks, depending on how far away you are. If you are not a member and you would like a copy of Chebacco, you can get one by going to our website and becoming a member. Go to mdihistory.org, mdihistory.org, and that's where you can get this. And to give you a sample of what's ahead, we're happy to welcome Dr. Bill Horner. Bill is the president of the board of Mount Desert Island Historical Society. He is a retired trauma surgeon. He's been retired for about 12 years. And much of the time after post-retirement, he's devoted to studying local history. And he's become a writer and historian. He's also an avid sailor. And this combined history all comes together in a remarkable way in the article that he's written for us that's titled Dr. William Begg, HMS Tenedos, The War of 1812 and the Battle of Norwood Cove. Bill, so glad you're able to join us. I wonder if you could begin by reading us a passage from your article.
Yeah, happy to do that. Why don't we start right at the top? In August of 1814, Dr. William Begg, a Scottish assistant ship surgeon serving aboard the British frigate HMS Tenedos, made the following entries in his journal. Thursday the 4th, weather cloudy with some swell. At noon, Monhegan Island in sight. Saturday the 5th, light airs and fine. Steering for Mount Desert. Beautiful moonlight at 11 p.m. going right before the wind with lower topmast, top gallant, and royal studding sails. Saturday, August 6th, moderate and fine at 4 p.m. Came to anchor off Cranberry Island, Mount Desert, in 10 fathoms of water. And so began what is an interesting episode in our local history, which resulted in so-called Battle of Norwood Cove, which is certainly uppermost in most people's minds here on the island when it comes to some of our history going back over 200 years. And I'd like to read the following entry, which took place on the 10th, Wednesday. This is now 6 days after the Tenedos came into what we now call the Great Harbor and anchored probably somewhere between Bear Island and Sutton's. So Wednesday the 10th, moderate breezes and hazy. At 4 a.m. sent the barge and cutter manned and armed to Norwich Creek to destroy the schooners before mentioned, the owners being unwilling or unable to ransom them. At 6:30 in the morning, the boats returned without being able to accomplish their purpose, owing to the incessant fire of musketry kept up by upwards of 100 men from behind rocks and bushes. From the situation in which our boats were placed in a narrow creek, with the enemy pointing their muskets into them from the tops of the rocks, it is certainly strange that they did not either kill or wound the whole of our people. Our getting off so cheaply must be attributed to a kind providence and the unsoldier-like conduct of the Yankees, who would not expose their precious carcasses long enough from the cover of the rocks to enable them to take deliberate aim.
So, Bill, you've been reading from your article, but your article is quoting some sources. And can you tell us about that source that you were just drawing from? I think that turns out to be fairly pretty central, and you've discovered a very interesting writer and viewpoint. Who are you talking about there?
Well, I'm talking about a young Scottish surgeon by the name of William Begg, who wrote a journal that is now located in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It describes his experiences of about 2 years duration aboard a British frigate, a man of war. When this was brought to my attention, I immediately fell in love with it because, first of all, the guy could write legibly. He wrote with a wonderful style, and a lot of the journal is actually decorated in his own hand, such as the cover that you're seeing right here. The other important primary source was the actual ship's log. And for those of you who may not know what a ship's log is, it's a daily, hour-by-hour entry of important navigational, weather, and other observations, which is the responsibility of a certain person on board the ship. And this became available to us from a person in London, where it is housed. And so between those two very valuable primary sources, I was able to both compare the versions of the events and to get a real flavor for what life was aboard one of these big British men of war.
Yeah, it's fair to say that you're writing a very local history, but this is international in its implications in 1812, and even in your writing it now. Lindsay Davies, an NYU professor teaching in London last year, went to the National Archives at Kew and photographed the log. And we also had help from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania retrieving the Begg's journal and allowing us to show this image. So we really drew from a wide range of sources to put this together. And what did you learn about William Begg and his life, and how he was what kind of influences brought him to Mount Desert Island in August 1814?
Well, Dr. Begg was educated in Edinburgh. Edinburgh, Scotland being the primary source of education for surgeons of the era. There was a substantial difference between medical education in England and in Scotland. The Scots, for example, took the study of anatomy extremely seriously, and most of the research and discoveries having to do with human anatomy indeed came from the work of Scots physicians and scientists. When I was in medical school, William and John Hunter were a couple who were constantly referred to. And so what really appealed to me was when Begg recorded in his journal the actual injuries sustained by 3 of the crew members of the Tenedos, I was really drawn to the precision and Latinized use of terminology in that description.
Did you feel, as a modern day surgeon, a connection with what Dr. Begg's experience was?
Oh, definitely. I felt a real kinship to him because I felt that he was kind of the prototype of a modern trauma surgeon. In that, his description and what I ultimately found through my research, descriptions of wound management in that era of some 200 years ago, is virtually identical to what we practice today. In contrast to that, however, injury was not the only thing that Dr. Begg or any other naval surgeon had to attend to. The more common scenario was simply contagious shipboard illness of a medical sort, what you might say would be relegated to the work of an internist in today's parlance. But in those days, the knowledge and understandings that underlay the identification of disease and its treatment were markedly different. So we have sort of 2 contrasting specialties here, if you will. We've got surgery, which at least in terms of trauma, was very well developed based on their intimate knowledge of anatomy, how to stop bleeding, where the blood vessels are on the one hand, but a very sort of foreign kind of concept of the medical illnesses that caused fever, for example, in that era, how they were assessed and how they were treated.
So they were pretty up to the mark in surgical treatment, but pretty far from the way we think about it in medical illnesses.
It's a very stark difference, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of maybe got ahead of ourselves a little bit. Can you take us through exactly what happened at the Battle of Norwood Cove? What was the Tenedos, British naval ship, doing there? What was the nature of the action that took place?
Well, this is another thing, the War of 1812, that drew me into this project, because I realized that I knew absolutely nothing about the War of 1812 other than the Star-Spangled Banner and Andrew Jackson beating the bloody British in the Battle of New Orleans. It turns out that the War of 1812 was an important, almost a point of division in American political life. It was a brand new union at the time, gotten through the Revolutionary War. There was an argument at the time as to whether there could be political parties or not. It was decided that they would have a 2-party system, the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans. And they were just as different as you could imagine. And without going into detail, the differences between their points of view had a lot to do with this unfortunate war with England. It was a complicated war that resulted in a near collapse of American shipping. And part of what was responsible for that was a naval blockade that was established by the British, the Royal Navy, that extended from headquarters in Halifax, Nova Scotia, all the way down the Atlantic seaboard. And so there were fleets of British military vessels, mostly of the sort that are referred to as frigates, that patrol the waters off New England and further on down as far as the Chesapeake and even further, to blockade those ports and to occasionally raid them. And that's what happened in the case of the HMS Tenedos dropping anchor here in our great harbor, as we call it today.
And by the way, this map is a commissioned by the British Parliament. It's the DeBar Atlantic Neptune. It was published in 1776. So it a little before our time, but pretty good representation of the landscape. Representation.
So yeah, let me just review this. I'm assuming everyone can see this, but you see where it says sound in the upper portion of this map. That is the mouth of what we call Somme Sound. And just below the word sound is today's Greening's Island. To the right of that, the small round island is Baker, and just below it or south of it is Sutton. And that's roughly the area where Tenedos dropped anchor.
I think you meant Bear Island, Bill.
I'm sorry, Bear, not
right,
Baker.
Bear and Sutton. So can you see my cursor on the screen?
Yeah.
Folks, we're learning the technology here. Yes, so you can see the cursor. So you got Bear, Sutton, and Greening.
So according to the ship's log, the two smaller craft, the barge and cutter, were actually deployed 2 days earlier from the Tenedos because they were looking for water and they were looking for food supply. They actually bought a 1,600-pound bullock from somebody and 284 pounds of potatoes. But I think they also did a little reconnaissance in toward what we call Southwest Harbor, which is over to the left-hand side of the map and up into Norwood Cove. And there were two schooners up in Norwood Cove. They were apparently told by the British that they had to pay a ransom, which was a common practice, or risk having their schooners destroyed. So being, I'm sure, stubborn Yankees, or there are any number of local tales associated with this, the two vessels returned to the Tenedos without ransom. And so it was on that basis that on the 10th, they were again deployed with the intent of destroying those schooners. And that's when they encountered the local militia and the Battle of Norwood Cove, as I've described it.
So one of the things you've settled is that according to accounts that were handed down through islanders, and it's an oft-told tale, there were perhaps 5 British Marines or sailors that were killed. And what you have been able to document is actually there were 3 who were wounded, according to British sources. And you can document
right.
the nature of
There's no record of any death,
right,
either in the ship's log or in Dr. Begg's account.
Well, Bill, let me advance you a little bit, because in your article, you have a pretty interesting description of something that didn't happen at Norwood Cove, but did happen during this phase of the War of 1812. And that was a broadside between 2 competing ships. And I think there are sections of your article that are pretty dramatic in their descriptions. And I can almost hear you as an author experiencing what happened in kind of a visceral way. You as a trauma surgeon being encountering such a scene. Can you talk about the effect of battle directly between 2 ships, such as the one pictured here, the HMS Shannon versus the USS Chesapeake?
Well, I guess I could say this is the worst imaginable form of trauma scenario. These were wooden ships, and the broadside was designed to inflict as much damage to the hull and rigging of the ship as possible. Tenedos, a frigate, was one of 6 in this patrol of the New England coast. And she had 38 guns, which were designed for longer action. And then she had a number of things called carronades, which were like mortars that would fire really heavy material of all kinds, with the design of wreaking havoc. If you could knock down the other frigates' rigging, take down the shrouds, take down the mast, and of course the vessel would be crippled. But at the same time, it was blasting away with the longer guns at the hull of the opposing vessel at very close range. These things frequently took took place at distances of no more than 25 to 50 yards. If you want a vivid example of it, my favorite all-time movie is Master and Commander, one of the O'Brien books that Russell Crowe stars as Jack Aubrey, and they do have a couple of broadsides in that movie, which is very graphic. The injuries were just awful. Part of it had to do with the lead that was flying back and forth. Probably at least as much had to do with the splinters that were converted to secondary missiles by the bombardment of the wooden hulls. It was just awful. If you went into one of these encounters, you knew there was going to be, at the very least, horrible injuries and, of course, loss of life.
And you describe, Bill, this instrument kit and its purpose, and in the absence of antibiotics, you've really got an interesting analysis of the effectiveness of amputation in the absence of antibiotics. Can you talk about that?
Well, here you see a surgeon's instrument kit from the era of the War of 1812. Many orthopedists would look at this and say, oh, that all looks very familiar. There's a bone saw on the top. There are a variety of knives. There are some trocars. And then you see these long sword-like structures on either side. Those are amputation knives. Penetrating injuries in the Napoleonic era, which is the one we're talking about, carried virtually a 100% death rate. If not from the immediate effect of the wound, then from secondary gangrene and infection. And so whenever it was possible, the part that was injured would be amputated. And obviously this only applied to extremities, arms and legs. Penetrating wounds, the abdomen, pelvis, were universally fatal.
Yeah.
But in the setting of a penetrating wound of an arm, for example, amputation could be carried out. There were no anesthetics at the time. There was something called laudanum, which is a mixture of opium and alcohol. There was, of course, rum. The tightness of the tourniquet could induce a degree of anesthesia, but it was mainly the speed of the surgeon that made this possible. And a good naval surgeon in that era could amputate an arm in two minutes or less. And
Bill, you pay some respect to this fellow pictured here in the middle, and we had some help from College of the Atlantic professor of art history, Catherine Klinger, who helped us understand where this painting is at the Institute of Medicine in Paris, and they let us have and publish a copy of it. But can you tell us about the scene here?
This is a scene from the Napoleonic era, and the gentleman to the right is Napoleon's chief surgeon, Dominique Jean Larrey. Here he's treating the wounded on the battlefield. Many of the terms that we use in trauma management are French origin, owing to this man's innovations. One being triage, that is the process of sorting out the priorities of who is going to be treated first and down. Ambulance, of course, is a French word, and he was the one who basically said we have to bring services to the battlefield and transport these people, wounded people, off as quickly as possible. And so in effect, he was predicting what would ultimately be the pattern in military medicine of trying to evacuate the injured as quickly as possible from the field of battle into an area removed from the battlefield via ambulance, or in today's parlance, helicopter for definitive treatment.
Well, Bill, I'm going to take this off. I'm going to take this off our screen sharing system and invite anybody watching to pose any questions in the few minutes we have left. We have some people commenting, a lot of people watching. I wonder if anybody has a question for us here, either on Facebook or directly on our Zoom feed. We have a couple of Hayas and proud to have been raised in Bernard, and we have Eloise Schultz watching from Oregon, and we have someone else. Okay, so Pauline, Bill wants to know what's your next article? Pauline, I bet you took that one by surprise. You have any thoughts on your next article, Bill?
My next article?
Yeah.
Well, my next most immediate article, given the COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing now, I'm doing some research with some help from other people on the history of pest houses here on Mount Desert Island and I suppose elsewhere. A pest house was, I guess, probably an unfortunate name. They were isolation buildings where people with the common contagious illnesses of the time, smallpox being the chief one among them, could be quarantined. And we've done a little geographic archaeology here in the last week or two and discovered what we think may be the foundation of an old pest house in Bar Harbor. Yeah,
one was along Breakneck Road, I think. I know the newspaper has accounts of that. Mm-hmm. But let's get to a couple more questions. Liz Graves asks, Bill, what was used to sterilize before amputations? Iodine?
I think iodine crystals or something like that may have been available, but sterilization in operating rooms or shipboard or any situation where you're having to treat somebody surgically was a long time coming. I believe it was Joseph Lister, much later in the 19th century, who finally convinced English surgeons to not only sterilize their instruments, but to gown up and use gloves. That was about 40 more years coming to the United States. It's fascinating to me how long it takes what seems like today very obvious ideas to be incorporated into practice.
And Ann Benson wants to know, What does Tenedos mean?
I don't know the meaning. I know there is an island of Tenedos off Turkey. Going back to ancient history, there were a couple of battles of Tenedos described when the Mediterranean was being contested among multiple parties, mainly Greeks and others.
Well, we reached our 5 o'clock hour, a 30-minute presentation, much faster than I thought we did. And Bill, I want to thank you for showing up for this and all the rehearsals we had leading up to it. Folks, we had to figure some stuff out before we could put this on, but we really appreciate you joining us from all around the world. It was great to spend this time with you. And we're going to have another Chebacco Chat session on Tuesday at 4:30. Watch this, watch our Facebook page for an announcement of the speaker and the topic. But it will be Tuesday at 4:30. We'll have another edition. But for now, thanks very much for signing on. Hope you all are healthy and happy and taking care of each other. We'll see you soon.
Good night.